Welcome to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we step into the rough, muddy, and unforgiving world of medieval travel. A world where every journey was an adventure, but not the exciting kind we imagine in movies. Instead, it was the exhausting, painful, and downright miserable sort. The kind that made you question why you ever left home in the first place. In the Middle Ages, the very idea of travel was drastically different from what we know today. In our modern world, we can hop on a plane, catch a train, or drive across entire countries in a matter of hours. We have air-conditioned vehicles, smooth roads, GPS systems, and convenient rest stops. But in medieval times, simply traveling to the next village could be a test of endurance, luck, and determination. Let's first understand the general mindset people had about travel back then. For the majority of medieval folk, life was intensely local. Most people were born, lived, worked, and died within a few miles of their birthplace. Generations of families rarely ventured beyond their home villages. There was a good reason for this. Leaving the familiar safety of home exposed travelers to a host of dangers: bandits, illness, getting lost, bad weather, and unpredictable political situations. The few who did travel, whether merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, or messengers, had no illusions about the hardships ahead. For them, every journey was a gamble. Each trip involved weeks or months of planning. Even the simplest trip required careful thought about supplies, safe routes, trusted guides, and weather forecasts, which were often little more than hopeful guesses. In medieval Europe, the landscape was rugged, forests dense, and mountains daunting. The roads, if you could even call them that, were often little more than dirt tracks carved out by generations of travelers and carts. Rain turned them into slippery mud pits. Snow made them impassable. Summer heat baked the roads into hard, uneven paths that could snap wagon wheels and injure horses. And yet, some people had to travel. Kings and their entourages moved from castle to castle. Merchants ventured across long distances to trade goods like spices, wool, and cloth. Pilgrims walked thousands of miles to reach holy sites like Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem. Soldiers marched under banners, often to battles that would leave many of them lying dead far from home. Even simple messengers carried royal edicts, marriage proposals, or declarations of war across vast distances. But none of these travelers enjoyed the comforts we take for granted today. There were no reliable inns along every road. No consistent postal system to send a message safely. No highways with service stations and clean restrooms. Instead, travelers faced the elements head-on. Their fate often depended on the kindness of strangers, sheer luck, and how well they could read the ever-changing dangers around them. Imagine waking up one morning, needing to travel 50 miles to the next town. For us today, that's an easy drive, maybe an hour depending on traffic. But for a medieval traveler, that meant at least 2 or 3 days on foot. On horseback, it might be slightly faster, but not by much. Every mile was an unpredictable challenge. Would the bridge ahead still be standing? Would you encounter a band of robbers? Would the weather hold, or would a sudden storm flood the path and force you to turn back? Even simple questions had complicated answers. Where would you sleep? There were inns, but they were few, far between, and often dirty and expensive. Many travelers had to rely on monasteries, which offered basic shelter to pilgrims and the poor. Otherwise, you might sleep outdoors or beg for hospitality at a village along the way. Food was another concern. You couldn't carry much with you, and what you brought often spoiled quickly. Villages along the way might sell basic bread, cheese, or dried meats, but there were no guarantees. Fresh water could be difficult to find, and drinking from streams or ponds carried the risk of illness. Danger wasn't limited to bandits or the elements. Even peaceful villages might be wary of strangers. Suspicion of outsiders was common, especially during times of plague or famine. Strangers could be accused of spreading disease or being spies. In some places, you might need a travel permit or letter of introduction to pass safely. And yet, Despite all these dangers, travel still happened. Goods needed to be moved, kings needed to be seen, churches drew the faithful, and armies marched. The roads were never completely empty. But each person who set out knew they were undertaking a difficult and hazardous task. Perhaps one of the most exhausting aspects of medieval travel was simply how long everything took. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. If you had to travel from England to Rome, for example, you might spend several months just reaching your destination, and hope you survived long enough to make the return trip. Time was measured differently back then. There were no clocks ticking away every second. Instead, time was experienced through the rising and setting of the sun, the changing seasons, and the rhythm of prayers and bells in monasteries. People accepted slowness as a fact of life. Impatience was useless because delays were inevitable. In many ways, medieval travelers had to become experts at waiting. Waiting for roads to dry. Waiting for safe passage. Waiting for better weather. Waiting for bridges to be repaired or for military conflicts to end. Travel required patience, resourcefulness, and a fair bit of courage. So tonight, as we begin this journey through the miserable experience of medieval travel, picture yourself lacing up rough, uncomfortable boots. You shoulder a heavy sack of supplies. The sky above you is gray, the path ahead uncertain. Each step forward is a step into the unknown. The road is long, dangerous, and slow, but you have no choice but to walk it. In the modern world, we take roads for granted. Highways stretch across entire continents. Paved streets connect cities, towns, and villages. Even the most remote areas often have some form of paved or well-maintained roads. But in the Middle Ages, the concept of a road was far more primitive. When you hear the word road today, you might imagine a smooth surface, with clear signs and lane markings. In medieval Europe, however, a road might simply be a wide dirt track, or a trail beaten down by centuries of foot traffic, carts, and livestock. There were no paving stones outside of a few cities and key trade routes. Instead, the road was whatever space remained after nature and man had worn it down. Let's picture a common medieval road. In dry weather, it might look harmless enough. A dusty path winding through fields and forests. But beneath the dusty surface lay deep grooves, where wagon wheels had dug into the dirt. The road was uneven, full of holes, and scattered with rocks. Horses stumbled often. Carts jolted violently. People on foot had to watch every step to avoid twisted ankles or falls. When the weather changed, and it often did, the real problems began. Rain quickly turned these dirt tracks into thick, sticky mud. The mud could be so deep that carts would sink axle deep, forcing travelers to stop and dig them out. Horses struggled to pull their loads. People slipped and fell, covered in cold, wet filth. In winter, snow and ice made travel nearly impossible. Without proper maintenance or snow removal, roads would disappear entirely under drifts of snow. Icy patches made walking or riding dangerous. Many travelers simply avoided long-distance trips during the winter months, knowing the risk of being stranded or frozen. In spring, melting snow and seasonal rains flooded low-lying paths. Some routes became shallow rivers. Footbridges, if they existed, were often swept away or damaged. Travelers would be forced to find alternate routes, often making long detours that added days, or even weeks to a journey. Forests added their own challenges. Dense woods often swallowed up paths, making it hard to see where the road even was. Overhanging branches, fallen trees, and thick undergrowth slowed progress. In some areas, travelers carried axes or swords just to clear a way forward. In mountainous regions, travel was even more treacherous. Narrow mountain passes with sheer drops tested the courage of even experienced travelers. Loose rocks and landslides blocked paths regularly. One misstep could send a traveler or horse tumbling down a cliff. Even in relatively flat areas, travel was not easy. Marshes and wetlands were common in many parts of Europe. Without proper drainage, these swampy areas could swallow carts and animals whole. Travelers sometimes had to build makeshift causeways, piling up logs and branches to create a temporary road across the soggy ground. The state of medieval roads depended greatly on who controlled the land. Some local lords and monasteries maintained small stretches of road, especially if they benefited trade or pilgrimage routes. But most roads were neglected. Maintenance required labor and money, and neither was plentiful. The Roman Empire had once built a vast network of well-engineered stone roads across Europe. Some of these roads survived into the Middle Ages, especially near major cities or trade hubs. But many fell into disrepair as the Roman world collapsed. Over centuries, grass, trees, and erosion reclaimed these marvels of engineering. Where stone roads did survive, they offered some relief. Roman roads were often straight, elevated, and well-drained. But even these had their challenges. Missing stones created hazards for carts and horses. Weeds grew between cracks. Sections collapsed under centuries of neglect. For the average traveler, choices were limited. Most people followed established routes based on word of mouth and local knowledge. Villagers passed along stories of where the road was passable, where bridges had collapsed, or where bandits lurked. Maps were rare, and even when available, they were often wildly inaccurate. Because of the poor state of roads, most people traveled in groups when possible. Safety in numbers protected against bandits and accidents. A group could also help free a stuck cart or carry supplies across a flooded stream. But traveling in groups came with its own challenges: more mouths to feed, more supplies to carry, and the slowest person setting the pace. Animal power was the backbone of medieval transportation, but animals struggled just as much as people. Horses could pull wagons, but only on reasonably dry, flat paths. Oxen were more powerful but much slower. Mules were often the best choice for mountainous or rough terrain, but even they had limits. When animals grew sick or injured, travelers could be stranded for days while they rested or searched for replacements. The poor state of roads didn't just slow travel, it limited it. Trade routes were carefully chosen based on where goods could physically be moved. Entire towns rose or fell depending on the condition of nearby routes. A bridge collapse could cut off commerce for months. A stretch of road ruined by flooding might redirect trade entirely. Because travel was so difficult, many medieval economies remained highly localized. Farmers sold their goods within a few miles of home. Artisans worked for local customers. Only luxury goods, spices, silk, fine cloth, traveled long distances, carried by wealthy merchants, who could afford large caravans and armed escorts. Governments occasionally tried to improve the roads, but progress was slow. In England, for example, the responsibility for road maintenance often fell to local parishes, under laws called statute labor. Villagers were required to spend a few days each year repairing nearby roads. But these efforts were patchy, and often poorly organized. As the centuries passed and trade grew, some important roads received better care. Pilgrimage routes, like the Way of St. James in Spain, developed networks of inns, bridges, and guides. Merchant routes across Europe saw periodic improvements. But for most of the medieval period, the majority of roads remained crude and unreliable. For the common traveler, every day on the road was a physical struggle. Slogging through mud, wrestling carts out of deep ruts, dodging fallen trees, braving cold winds, rain, and burning sun. Exhaustion set in quickly. Blisters formed. Muscles atched. And always, the slow march forward continued, mile after miserable mile. As you lay here tonight, drifting off to sleep, imagine the sound of wagon wheels creaking through thick mud. The squelch of boots sinking into wet ground. The labored breathing of horses straining against their harnesses. The road stretches endlessly ahead, with no guarantee of shelter, food, or safety. This was the grim reality of medieval travel, where even the simplest journey became an exhausting ordeal. When we think of travel today, speed is one of our greatest luxuries. We can fly across oceans in hours, drive hundreds of miles in a single day, or even have packages delivered overnight from the other side of the world. In the Middle Ages, however, speed was a foreign concept. Every journey was slow, painfully slow, and no matter how you traveled, you were guaranteed to feel every exhausting mile. The overwhelming majority of people in medieval Europe traveled on foot. Shoes, if you had them, were simple leather constructions, thin, uncomfortable, and offering little protection from the rough, uneven paths. Walking meant facing sharp rocks, deep mud, cold puddles, and countless blisters. Most peasants owned little more than the clothes on their backs and whatever small bundle they could carry. Travelers often wrapped their belongings in cloth sacks, or carried them tied to wooden sticks over their shoulders. The weight of supplies quickly became a burden. Bread, salted meat, and water added precious pounds, making each step heavier than the last. Walking pace varied, but an average traveler might cover 15 to 20 miles per day, if conditions were favorable. Mud, rain, injuries, or detours could easily cut that in half. Long journeys stretched into weeks or months. Even a relatively short trip of 100 miles could consume the better part of 2 weeks for someone on foot. Then there were the aches and pains. Sore feet were a constant companion. Swollen ankles, pulled muscles, and aching backs plagued travelers daily. There were no comfortable resting places along most routes, just hard ground, damp grass, or the rare shelter of a monastery or friendly home. For those lucky or wealthy enough to ride, horseback offered some relief, but it came with its own set of challenges. Horses were expensive and required constant care. They needed food, water, and rest just like their riders. A tired or injured horse could delay a journey for days or even end it entirely. Medieval saddles were simple and far less comfortable than modern designs. Long hours in the saddle left riders with sore legs, stiff backs, and bruised thighs. Without proper stirrups or padding, even experienced riders often found their legs going numb after hours of travel. Speed on horseback was only slightly better than walking. A well-maintained horse could cover perhaps 25 to 30 miles per day under good conditions. But bad roads, poor weather, and obstacles could slow them down just as easily. Over long distances, the difference between walking and riding wasn't always dramatic. Pack animals like mules and donkeys offered another option. They were sturdier than horses, better suited for rough terrain, and required less food. But they were also slower and less comfortable to ride. Merchants often used strings of mules to carry heavy loads of goods across mountains or forests. The caravan would plod along at a careful, deliberate pace, avoiding dangerous paths and steep drops. Carts and wagons were another common method, particularly for merchants or families moving larger loads. But wagons were almost entirely dependent on the condition of the roads. Deep ruts, mud, and narrow paths made cart travel painfully slow. Oxen pulled heavy loads at a crawl, perhaps 10 miles on a good day, and often much less. The slow pace of medieval travel had enormous consequences. News traveled slowly, sometimes taking weeks or months to reach distant regions. Royal decrees, trade offers, marriage proposals, and military orders crawled across the continent at the pace of tired men and horses. Delays were expected, and time itself seemed to move differently. Waiting weeks for someone's arrival was perfectly normal. There were no instant messengers, no telegraphs, no rapid deliveries. Urgency was often a luxury people simply couldn't afford. Weather was a constant enemy of speed. Heavy rains turned dirt roads into impassable mud pits. Snow and ice closed mountain passes entirely. Travelers often found themselves waiting days or weeks for conditions to improve enough to continue. The journey paused at the whim of nature. Traveling in groups didn't always speed things up either. Larger groups moved more slowly, as the slowest member set the pace. Herding animals, coordinating stops, and ensuring everyone stayed together added complications. If one person fell ill, or a wagon broke down, the entire group might be forced to stop. Rest stops were simple affairs. There were no cozy inns with soft beds and warm meals every few miles. Travelers often slept outdoors, in makeshift camps, or beneath crude shelters. Fires provided some warmth and protection, but rain, cold winds, and insects made restful sleep a rare luxury. Food also slowed travelers. Carrying enough provisions for long journeys was nearly impossible. Travelers had to stop frequently to resupply, buy food from local villages, or hunt and forage along the way. A day without finding food meant marching hungry, further draining energy and slowing progress. Beyond the physical challenges, the psychological weight of slow travel took its toll. Days blurred together in monotonous repetition. The same muddy paths, the same forests, the same endless fields stretched before the traveler's weary eyes. The goal always seemed distant, retreating just beyond reach. Even kings and nobles, despite their wealth, could not escape the slowness of medieval travel. Royal progresses, where monarchs moved from castle to castle, required massive logistical planning. Entire entourages of servants, soldiers, and courtiers followed, moving at a crawl. Weeks or months were required to travel between major cities. Pilgrims making religious journeys faced particularly long and painful treks. The road to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or the long march to Canterbury in England, could take months of walking under harsh conditions. Yet many persisted, driven by faith, obligation, or desperation. The painfully slow pace of travel shaped medieval life in profound ways. It limited the reach of rulers. It isolated communities. It made distant lands seem unimaginably far away, almost like foreign worlds. Even neighboring villages could feel distant simply because of the time it took to get there. As you lie in your bed tonight, think of the endless march. Boots squelching through mud. Horses plodding step by step. The wind whispering through ancient trees. The sun setting slowly on a path that seems to stretch on forever. A journey with no fast forward button, where every inch forward was earned through aching muscles and sheer determination. In our modern world, navigation is almost effortless. We have satellites orbiting above us, guiding us turn by turn to our destinations. Detailed maps exist for even the most remote areas. With just a few taps on a screen, we can calculate routes, find rest stops, and estimate arrival times with remarkable accuracy. But in the Middle Ages, navigation was an entirely different experience, one riddled with confusion, uncertainty, and the ever-present risk of getting hopelessly lost. The first problem was simple: most people had no maps at all. The average medieval peasant would never have seen a map in their entire life. They navigated their world through oral tradition, memory, and local knowledge. They knew which direction the next village lay, which landmarks to follow, and which paths were safest, but only within a small radius of their home. Anything beyond that was a step into the unknown. For those few who did possess maps, the situation wasn't much better. Medieval maps were often works of art rather than practical tools. Many were highly symbolic, filled with religious imagery, mythical creatures, and vague outlines of lands far away. The famous Mappa Mundi in Hereford Cathedral, for example, offers a fascinating glimpse into the medieval worldview, but provides little practical guidance for travelers trying to find a road from one town to another. The limited maps that aimed for practicality still suffered from major flaws. Scale was inconsistent or entirely absent. Distances were rough guesses. Directions were often based on hearsay rather than accurate surveying. Mountains, rivers, and forests might be placed miles away from their true locations. Entire towns could be misplaced or missing altogether. Because of these issues, most travelers didn't even attempt to navigate by map. Instead, they relied on asking for directions from locals along the way. A journey became a continuous series of conversations with farmers, shepherds, merchants, and fellow travelers. Each offered advice, sometimes helpful, sometimes confusing, and occasionally flat out wrong. Landmarks became crucial. People followed rivers, mountain ridges, coastlines, and even certain trees or rocks known locally as waypoints. Churches with tall spires could be seen from a distance and used as beacons. Major monasteries or castles also served as fixed points to guide travelers. But fog, storms, or unfamiliar territory could easily obscure these landmarks and leave travelers wandering aimlessly. In forests, getting lost was particularly easy and dangerous. Dense woods swallowed paths completely. Without clear skies or distant landmarks, travelers could walk in circles for hours or days. Many medieval forests were vast, dark, and filled with real threats, wild animals, dangerous terrain, and sometimes outlaws. Mountains posed a different challenge. Narrow paths zigzagged up steep slopes. Fog could roll in suddenly, erasing visibility entirely. A wrong turn could lead travelers off the edge of a cliff or into isolated valleys with no clear exit. In winter, snow covered paths entirely, leaving travelers to rely on memory or sheer luck. Even in more populated areas, travelers could become lost between villages that lay just a few miles apart. Road signs, as we know them today, were virtually non-existent. At best, travelers might find crude wooden markers or stones, but these were rare and often damaged by weather or thieves. In some regions, pilgrimage routes were among the few well-marked paths. Roads like the Way of St. James in Spain or the Via Francigena to Rome developed clearer markers over time, crosses, shrines, or hostels built to aid travelers. Even so, pilgrims frequently lost their way, especially in remote stretches. Language differences added yet another layer of confusion. Travelers moving between regions or countries encountered unfamiliar dialects or entirely different languages. Misunderstandings were common. A simple question for directions could result in contradictory or unintelligible answers. Even seasoned merchants and messengers, who traveled frequently, sometimes found themselves disoriented. They developed mental maps, memorizing certain key features, but changes in weather, road conditions, or political boundaries could easily render their knowledge outdated. For those venturing across seas or deserts, navigation became even more mysterious. Mariners used rudimentary charts, stars, and coastal landmarks to guide their ships, but storms, fog, or miscalculations often led them far off course. Desert travelers relied on experienced guides, who memorized dunes, oases, and celestial patterns, but even they could become lost if conditions shifted. The consequences of getting lost in the Middle Ages could be dire. A wrong turn might lead travelers into hostile territory, controlled by rival lords or bandits. Supplies could run out. Exposure to the elements, cold, heat, or storms, could become fatal. In some cases, lost travelers simply vanished, their fates unknown. For this reason, experienced travelers often hired guides when moving through unfamiliar regions. These local guides possessed intimate knowledge of the land, where the safe paths lay, which rivers to cross, where dangers lurked. But even the best guides could make mistakes, and many charged high fees for their services. As you lie quietly, breathing softly, imagine walking a lonely medieval path. The dense forest closes in. The path splits unexpectedly. Which way leads to the next village? The sky darkens as clouds gather. Your supplies feel lighter than they should, food nearly gone. The wind whispers through the trees, and you realize how far you are from home, from safety. This was the constant fear of the medieval traveler, not knowing if the path ahead led forward or deeper into danger. In the quiet safety of your bed tonight, you know that if you travel tomorrow, you will have police, highways, and countless protections to keep you safe. But in the Middle Ages, the moment you stepped beyond the walls of your village, town, or castle, you entered a world filled with dangers. One of the greatest fears haunting every traveler was not simply getting lost, nor even the slow pace of the journey. It was the ever-present threat of ambush, by bandits, robbers, and desperate men lurking in the shadows. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, fiefdoms, and lawless lands. Authority varied wildly from one region to the next. Some roads near royal cities were patrolled by guards or protected by local lords. But venture just a few miles beyond, and you entered zones where no one could protect you. Lawlessness flourished in the gaps between powers, and these gaps stretched across vast areas. Banditry was not simply the work of a few wicked men, it was often a survival strategy. Famines, wars, Failed harvests and crushing taxes drove desperate peasants into outlawry. Some were former soldiers who, after wars ended, found themselves without pay or purpose. Others were simply criminals who saw an opportunity to prey on the vulnerable. The tools of their trade were simple but effective. Clubs, knives, swords, and bows gave them power over unarmed or poorly defended travelers. They operated in small bands, often hidden in forests, hills, or remote crossroads. Narrow paths and thick woods provided perfect ambush sites, where travelers could be trapped with little chance of escape. For merchants and wealthy travelers, the risk was even higher. Carrying silver, gold, or valuable goods made them irresistible targets. Word of a merchant caravan traveling through the region could quickly reach outlaw ears. Bandits might set elaborate traps, blocking roads with felled trees, staging false accidents, or disguising themselves as fellow travelers before turning on their victims. The fear of banditry was so constant that many travelers joined larger groups to protect themselves. Merchant caravans hired armed guards. Pilgrims moved together in great numbers. Nobles traveled with entourages of soldiers and servants. Strength in numbers offered some safety, but even large groups were not immune. Bandit attacks were swift and brutal. An ambush could begin with a sudden rain of arrows or a blocked road. Robbers would rush in, overwhelming travelers, before they could organize any defense. Those who resisted risked injury or death. Many chose to surrender their goods, hoping to be spared further harm. Sometimes, though, robbers were not content with simple theft. Hostages might be taken for ransom. Women were especially vulnerable to horrific violence. Those who could not pay might be sold into slavery or simply killed and left on the roadside. The consequences of falling into bandit hands could be catastrophic. Certain regions became notorious for their lawlessness. The dense forests of Sherwood in England, the wild mountains of the Pyrenees between France and Spain, or the lonely roads through the Germanic forests all gained reputations as dangerous territory. Travelers dreaded these areas, often praying before entering them, and celebrating once safely through. Local lords and kings sometimes tried to control banditry by issuing harsh punishments. Public executions, hangings, and torture served as warnings to others. But the power of the law was limited. In many cases, corrupt officials turned a blind eye or even collaborated with bandits, sharing in their profits. In truly remote areas, there was simply no one to enforce justice. Travelers developed strategies to minimize their risks. They avoided traveling at night whenever possible. The darkness offered cover to waiting robbers and made defense nearly impossible. Instead, they sought the protection of monasteries, walled towns, or guarded inns before sunset. Some disguised their wealth, dressing in plain clothes and hiding valuables within their clothing, or secret compartments in carts. Others paid tolls to local lords who promised, though did not always deliver, safe passage through their lands. Certain regions even developed unofficial protection rackets, where travelers paid bandits themselves for a guarantee of safe travel. There were also professional road wardens in some areas, men hired by lords or guilds to patrol dangerous stretches of road. But these guards were few in number and could not patrol everywhere at once. Their presence offered some comfort but little guarantee of safety. For the average person, the fear of bandits haunted every step of a journey. Even a short trip to a neighboring village could carry danger. Every bend in the road, every rustle in the bushes, every distant sound might signal an ambush waiting to spring. Imagine, as you lie still tonight, walking through such a world. The narrow dirt path winds between tall trees. Shadows flicker in the dying light. Every sound makes you tighten your grip on the walking stick you carry, not for support, but as a poor weapon if the worst should happen. The wind sighs through the leaves, and for a moment, you feel entirely alone, and entirely vulnerable. In the still quiet of your room tonight, your body rests in safety, protected by modern medicine, clean water, and warm shelter. But for the medieval traveler, every step of the journey carried an invisible threat that was far more terrifying than bandits or wild animals. That threat was sickness, always waiting, always lurking, ready to strike at any moment. Medieval Europe was a land filled with diseases, many of which we can barely imagine today. Medicine was primitive, and knowledge of germs, bacteria, or viruses was entirely absent. People did not understand how diseases spread, and as they moved from village to village, so too did sickness travel along the dusty roads. The first danger was simple exposure. Travelers endured harsh conditions, blistering heat, icy winds, torrential rain, and damp, cold nights sleeping on the ground. Wet clothing clung to the skin, never fully drying before the next storm arrived. In such conditions, coughs and fevers spread quickly. A simple cold could turn deadly. Without effective treatments, pneumonia, bronchitis, or infections of the lungs could follow. The body weakened by constant travel, and poor nutrition had little strength to fight off these illnesses. Food poisoning was another constant danger. Travelers often ate whatever they could find: stale bread, salted meats, foraged plants, or questionable meals from roadside vendors. Spoiled or contaminated food led to stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration. Without modern understanding of bacteria, people had no way of knowing whether the meal before them was safe or deadly. Water was equally risky. Streams, rivers, and wells could carry diseases like dysentery, cholera, or parasites. Drinking from a clear mountain spring might seem safe, but hidden dangers lurked in the unseen world of microbes. Dire heel diseases struck travelers often, draining their strength and leaving them weak and vulnerable. Insects added their own cruel contributions to the travelers' misery. Fleas, lice, and ticks infested clothing and bedding. They bit, itched, and spread disease from one person to another. The notorious bubonic plague, carried by fleas living on rats, needed only a few infected travelers to ignite entire regional outbreaks. Malaria lingered in many regions, especially near swamps and marshlands. A single mosquito bite could bring waves of fever, chills, and debilitating weakness that might last for weeks or longer. Wounds sustained on the road posed their own dangers. A simple cut or blister could become infected without proper care. With no antibiotics, infections often led to painful abscesses, gangrene, or even death from sepsis. Dirty bandages, unclean hands, and a lack of sanitation turned minor injuries into life-threatening conditions. Hospitals, where they existed, offered little relief. Monasteries sometimes provided care, but the understanding of medicine was deeply rooted in superstition and limited practical knowledge. Treatments often involved prayers, bloodletting, or strange herbal remedies that sometimes helped, but often made things worse. Contagious diseases spread rapidly along trade routes and pilgrimage paths. As travelers met in inns, marketplaces, and churches, they unknowingly passed infections from one town to another. An outbreak that began in one distant village could spread across entire regions in mere months. Leprosy was one of the most feared diseases of all. Those afflicted were often forced into isolated colonies, shunned by society and travelers alike. Encountering a leper on the road struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest travelers, though leprosy's true methods of transmission were not well understood. The Black Death, of course, cast the darkest shadow of all. In the mid-14th century, the plague swept across Europe, killing tens of millions. Entire towns were abandoned. Roads grew silent. Travelers became pariahs, suspected of carrying death wherever they went. Fear gripped the continent for years. But even in ordinary years, minor illnesses could spell doom. Without family or familiar doctors nearby, a sick traveler depended entirely on the mercy of strangers, or their own ability to recover. A traveler who fell ill might be left behind by companions, alone in a strange place with no resources or care. Pregnancy on the road was especially dangerous. Women who traveled while pregnant faced the constant threat of miscarriage, premature labor, or complications with no midwife nearby. Childbirth itself was risky even in the best conditions. On the road, it was perilous. Superstitions only worsened the problem. Many believed that illness was punishment for sins, evil spirits, or imbalances in the body's humors. Rather than seeking effective treatment, some submitted to bizarre rituals, hoping to cleanse themselves spiritually while their bodies continued to suffer physically. And yet, despite all this, people still traveled. Merchants followed trade routes. Pilgrims pursued salvation. Nobles journeyed for politics, marriages, and wars. They accepted the risks because, in their world, danger was simply part of life. Tonight, as you breathe softly, imagine the heavy burden these travelers carried. The dull ache of fever setting into tired limbs. The gnawing hunger of an empty stomach. The sharp pain of an untreated wound. And always, the quiet, gnawing fear, would the next village bring relief or another grave? As you rest comfortably tonight in your soft bed, safe beneath your familiar roof, imagine what it would feel like to stop for rest after a long day of travel, in the Middle Ages. Your feet are sore, your muscles ache, and the road behind you stretches endlessly into the horizon. You are desperate for shelter, food, and warmth. But in the medieval world, finding a place to rest was not as simple as booking a room or finding a cozy inn. In many parts of medieval Europe, formal inns were rare. Large towns or cities might have a few establishments where travelers could find lodging, but along the dusty, isolated roads that crisscrossed the countryside, options were limited. Most travelers relied on a patchwork of lodging solutions, each with its own risks and discomforts. Monasteries often served as the safest places for weary travelers. Monks offered shelter to pilgrims, the poor, and sometimes even merchants or wandering nobles. These religious houses provided a bed, usually little more than a wooden plank or straw mattress, and a simple meal. But space was limited, and not every monastery accepted travelers without good reason. Where no monastery was available, travelers sought out taverns or allayhouses. These establishments were far from the cozy inns of romantic imagination. The rooms were often dark, smoky, and crowded. Straw bedding was rarely changed, and lice or fleas were common companions. The air was thick with the smells of sweat, unwashed bodies, stale beer, and cooking fires. Privacy was nearly non-existent. A room might contain multiple strangers, all snoring, coughing, or mumbling in their sleep. Thieves and pickpockets prowled these shared spaces, taking advantage of travelers who drifted into exhausted slumber. Even among supposed allies, trust was thin. In many cases, inns charged exorbitant prices. The quality of service often did not match the cost. Wealthier travelers might secure a private chamber, but even these offered little comfort beyond a small bed, a wooden stool, and perhaps a chamber pot. The linens were rarely clean, and bedbugs feasted freely. Food was basic. A meal might consist of coarse bread, hard cheese, salted fish, or a thin stew of questionable origin. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare, especially in winter months. Ale or watered wine accompanied most meals, as drinking water was often unsafe. Outside of towns, travelers might seek refuge in small farmhouses. Hospitality was a valued custom in many regions, and peasants occasionally offered shelter to strangers. But these homes were cramped, smoky, and shared with livestock. A traveler might find themselves sleeping on a dirt floor beside goats or chickens. The warmth was welcome, but the air was heavy with the smells of animals and unwashed humans alike. When no other options existed, travelers camped under the open sky. They gathered around small fires, hoping to ward off the cold and keep wild animals at bay. Wolves prowled nearby forests, and the distant howl of a pack could chill the blood. Insects buzzed and bit throughout the night, and rain or snow offered little mercy. Even the wealthiest travelers faced these difficulties. Nobles might travel with tents, servants, and supplies, but they too suffered from weather, discomfort, and disease. Their wealth provided some measure of comfort but could not fully shield them from the harsh realities of medieval travel. Inns along pilgrimage routes offered slightly more structure. Popular routes to places like Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome developed networks of hostels designed to accommodate pilgrims. These hostels varied in quality, some managed by religious orders, others by private owners seeking profit. Yet even these places were overcrowded, unsanitary, and far from luxurious. Security was a constant concern. Locks were rare or easily broken. Bandits sometimes posed as fellow travelers, gaining entry to inns only to rob or attack guests during the night. Travelers slept lightly, weapons within reach, always prepared for danger. Despite the risks, the custom of offering hospitality persisted. Stories tell of kind-hearted peasants, monks, or innkeepers who aided lost or desperate travelers, offering what little they had. In a world so filled with danger, these acts of generosity shone brightly. Tonight, as you lie safe and warm, imagine the weary medieval traveler settling into a smoky room. The straw mattress scratches against rough fabric. A single candle flickers against dark wooden walls. Outside, the wind whistles, carrying with it distant sounds of wolves or travelers hurrying along the night road. The traveler sighs, clutching their pack tightly beneath their head, knowing sleep may come lightly, if at all. As you slowly breathe in and out tucked beneath the safe and warm embrace of your blankets tonight, you are far removed from the untamed wilderness that once covered much of medieval Europe. But if you had been a traveler hundreds of years ago, each nightfall would bring not peaceful rest, but the heavy weight of dread, as the dark world around you filled with threats from the natural world. The wild was not just a scenic backdrop to the medieval traveler, it was a living, breathing, dangerous force. Roads were little more than dirt paths, winding through vast forests, thick swamps, desolate moors, rocky hills, and remote valleys. Beyond the safety of town walls and stone fortifications, nature reigned supreme. Forests dominated much of the European landscape. These were not the neatly trimmed parks or managed woodlands we might imagine today. The medieval forest was a dense, shadowy expanse of towering trees, tangled undergrowth, and endless labyrinths of pathways that could easily confuse even the most experienced traveler. Under the heavy canopy of leaves, daylight faded quickly into dim twilight, and in many places, it felt as though the sun rarely reached the forest floor. The air was damp and cool, filled with the musky scent of decaying leaves, wet earth, and distant streams trickling unseen through the underbrush. For travelers, these forests concealed far more than their destinations. They were home to wild animals, many of which posed serious threats. Wolves were among the most feared. Packs roamed across much of Europe, howling under the moonlight, their voices echoing through the trees and filling travelers with cold fear. A single wolf might not risk attacking a human, but a hungry pack, desperate after a harsh winter, could easily see a lone traveler or weakened horse as prey. Stories of travelers surrounded and devoured by wolves haunted the imaginations of medieval men and women. Wolves were not mythical beasts, they were an everyday reality for those who dared to cross the wild. And wolves were not the only danger. Bears lurked in many of the northern and mountainous regions. Large and powerful, a startled bear could be terrifyingly aggressive, especially if protecting cubs or searching for food. With no firearms and only crude weapons for defense, few travelers could hope to survive a direct encounter. Even simply stumbling upon a bear's path in the twilight could turn an ordinary journey into a desperate fight for survival. In the more southern reaches of Europe, wild boars posed their own unique threat. These fierce animals were known for their sharp tusks, powerful charges, and unpredictable aggression. A wild boar could easily gore a man or horse before help could arrive. Their sudden appearances from the undergrowth kept travelers constantly alert, scanning the path ahead with wary eyes. But animals were only one part of nature's arsenal. The weather itself often proved a merciless foe. Rainstorms could drench travelers in minutes, soaking their clothes and chilling their bodies to the bone. There were no waterproof coats or synthetic fabrics, only wool, leather, and cloaks that became heavy and useless once saturated. Wet feet and cold skin led easily to illness, as we have seen before, making even a simple rainstorm a deadly hazard on the road. Snow and ice in winter months turned travel into a desperate battle against the elements. Roads vanished beneath thick drifts of snow. Slippery paths could send horses and carts tumbling into ditches or frozen streams. A traveler trapped by a sudden snowstorm might freeze before reaching the next village or monastery. The cold was not merely uncomfortable, it was a constant killer. In the summer, the dangers changed but did not lessen. Heat beat down on travelers relentlessly, leading to dehydration, sunstroke, and fatigue. Water sources, as we've noted, were often polluted, forcing travelers to choose between drinking potentially contaminated water or risking dehydration under the blazing sun. Insects thrived in the heat, mosquitoes, fleas, and ticks feasted on exposed skin, spreading disease and leaving itchy, infected bites behind. Swamps and marshlands brought unique perils of their own. Beyond the mosquitoes and the heavy, stagnant air, travelers risked becoming lost in the endless maze of reeds and waterlogged paths. The ground beneath them could shift suddenly into treacherous bogs, swallowing feet, carts, or even entire animals. Many a medieval traveler met their end trapped in a muddy quagmire, unable to free themselves as exhaustion overtook them. The very darkness of the medieval wilderness played cruel tricks on the mind. As the sun set, familiar landmarks disappeared into blackness. The moon and stars offered little guidance, beneath heavy clouds or dense canopies. Strange sounds filled the night, twigs snapping, distant growls, the soft patter of unseen creatures moving nearby. Many travelers swore they were being watched by eyes they could never see, their imaginations feeding on the many folktales of goblins, witches, and forest spirits said to haunt the wild places. And so, each journey became not merely a physical trial, but a test of courage. Even groups of travelers, though safer, carried this underlying fear as they set up campfires at night, posting guards and listening carefully for any hint of danger in the darkness beyond. Superstition mixed with real threats, weaving a constant, low hum of anxiety into every step through the untamed world. There were no modern maps or reliable landmarks to provide assurance. Rivers changed course, paths overgrown quickly when not used, and travelers often relied on word-of-mouth directions, local guides, or distant church spires to find their way. Getting lost in the wilderness could quickly turn deadly, as supplies dwindled and the dangers of hunger, thirst, and exposure grew. And yet, despite all this, people kept moving. Merchants pressed forward to trade their goods, pilgrims ventured bravely toward holy shrines, messengers raced across kingdoms with news of war or peace, and wandering minstrels sought out new audiences for their songs. Each step into the wilderness was a gamble, a risk weighed carefully against the hope of survival. Tonight, as you gently drift further into sleep, picture the medieval traveler settling into a small clearing beneath ancient trees. The campfire crackles softly, casting flickering light onto worn faces. Beyond the warm circle of flame lies endless shadow, filled with the soft movements of creatures that do not sleep. The night air is cool and damp, carrying distant howls and rustling branches. But here, in this moment, you are safe, warm, and far from those long-forgotten dangers. Allow your breath to steady, your muscles to relax, and let the wilds of the medieval world fade quietly into your dreams. As you lie comfortably beneath your blankets, your mind free from the worries of ancient struggles, imagine yourself not simply walking the medieval road, but planning your journey before even taking that first step. In the Middle Ages, before any boot touched the path, before any wagon wheel rolled over the dust, there loomed one of the greatest obstacles of all, the cost. Travel was not only dangerous, exhausting, and uncertain, it was staggeringly expensive in ways both obvious and hidden, draining every coin from even the most careful traveler's purse. For the ordinary person, a peasant or craftsman, simply dreaming of distant travel was often an impossibility. Their entire lives revolved around the village or town where they were born. The price of leaving home was not just financial but social. Leaving meant abandoning crops, family duties, guild responsibilities, or feudal obligations. But even for merchants, nobles, clergy, or pilgrims, those with reasons and permissions to travel, the financial burden was always looming. To begin with, there was the basic cost of provisions. A traveler needed food and drink for the road. Bread, cheese, salted meat, dried fruits, and grains had to be purchased or carefully packed before departure. These foods were not always cheap, particularly in times of poor harvest or war. And because food spoiled quickly without preservation methods, travelers often had to restock frequently, buying new supplies in unfamiliar markets along the way, often at inflated prices. Water, though seemingly free, carried its own hidden costs. Travelers sometimes paid locals for access to private wells or safe springs, particularly in dry or dangerous regions, where safe water was scarce. Unsafe drinking sources risked illness, which could then lead to more expenses for care, shelter, or extended stays while recovering. The next major cost was transportation itself. While some people traveled on foot, wealthier travelers needed horses, mules, or oxen to carry both themselves and their goods. Purchasing or renting animals was expensive. Horses especially were valuable property, requiring not only the initial cost, but also continuous expenses for feed, grooming, and care. A sick or injured horse could mean disaster, forcing a traveler to buy a replacement, or risk being stranded far from home. Then came equipment, saddles, tack, carts, wagons, shoes, and tools. These items wore down quickly on rough medieval roads. Wagon wheels cracked on rocky paths, leather bridles snapped, wooden axles splintered. Replacing or repairing these items in remote areas often meant dealing with blacksmiths or merchants who charged steep prices, knowing the traveler had few alternatives. Clothing also represented a cost. Traveling required durable garments, woolen cloaks, thick boots, hats, gloves, and belts, all designed to withstand harsh weather and long days. Multiple sets were rare, so clothing had to last. When garments tore or wore thin, replacements were costly, especially far from home where merchants could take advantage of travelers' desperation. Lodging was another continual expense. As we have seen, inns and taverns were not only uncomfortable but often overpriced. In some towns, the local innkeeper might hold a monopoly on available rooms, allowing them to charge whatever they wished. Prices varied depending on the traveler's class and appearance. A well-dressed merchant might be charged double what a humble pilgrim paid, simply because the innkeeper assumed greater wealth. Even monasteries, though more charitable, sometimes requested donations or offerings in exchange for shelter and food. While not mandatory, these contributions were expected, adding yet another subtle financial pressure on the weary traveler. Beyond these ordinary expenses lay the constant shadow of tolls and tariffs. Medieval roads were not public highways in the modern sense. Many were controlled by lords, bishops, or local rulers who imposed tolls for passage through their lands. Bridges, mountain passes, city gates, and river crossings were prime spots for toll collectors. Some roads might require payment at multiple points, each toll chipping away at the traveler's coin purse. For merchants transporting goods, these fees could be crushing. Every region had its own system of customs duties, tariffs, and inspection fees. Local officials might demand payment on both incoming and outgoing goods, sometimes arbitrarily adjusting the rates based on personal greed or corruption. In extreme cases, entire cargoes could be confiscated if officials deemed the proper taxes unpaid, leaving merchants bankrupt. And always, there was bribery. In many places, travelers found that a small bribe could speed their passage, avoid extra scrutiny, or secure favorable treatment. But these small payments accumulated quickly, becoming an informal yet unavoidable cost of doing business on the road. Hiring guards or escorts was another major expense. Because bandits and highwaymen posed such constant danger, many travelers hired armed men to accompany them, either privately or as part of larger caravans. These guards expected regular wages, food, and sometimes a share of the goods being transported as part of their payment. Without them, the risks of theft or violence increased dramatically. Even religious pilgrimages carried heavy costs. The church might offer indulgences or spiritual protection, but pilgrims still needed food, shelter, transportation, and supplies. Some paid guides, joined organized groups, or made offerings at shrines along the way, all draining what little money they had. Poorer pilgrims sometimes sold possessions, or borrowed heavily to fund their journeys, returning home in debt if they returned at all. Legal fees occasionally emerged as well. If a traveler was accused of breaking local laws, violating customs regulations, or failing to pay a toll, they might face court fines or even imprisonment. Legal systems varied from one region to the next, and justice was often more about money than fairness. And then there were the purely unpredictable costs: sudden illness requiring medicine or care, lost or stolen goods, broken wagons, dead animals, bad weather forcing extended stays in costly towns, or unexpected political conflicts that closed certain routes altogether. A journey carefully budgeted at its start could easily double or triple in cost before reaching its end. Despite all this, people still traveled, knowing full well the risks to both life and purse. The rewards, whether spiritual salvation, lucrative trade, political alliances, or personal adventure, were deemed worth the staggering expense. Yet for most, travel remained a pursuit for the determined, the desperate, or the truly fortunate few who could afford its tolls. Now, as you breathe softly in your quiet room, let your thoughts drift gently away from the heavy burdens of medieval travelers. Their worries about coins and debts, about hungry tollkeepers and greedy innkeepers, about broken wheels and empty purses, have long faded into history. Tonight, you owe nothing to the road. Your journey is complete. The warmth of your bed, the softness of your pillow, and the steady rhythm of your breath are your only companions. Let sleep carry you now, far from the costly paths of the past, into peaceful, silent rest. As your eyes grow heavier, and your body relaxes deeper into the comfort of your bed, let us continue wandering along the long and treacherous paths of medieval travel. Tonight, we leave behind the dangerous forests, the hungry wolves, and the heavy cost of supplies, and step quietly into yet another peril that haunted the mind of every traveler who dared to journey far from home: the unpredictable and ever-present threat of war and political conflict. The medieval world was a patchwork of shifting alliances, feuding lords, rival kingdoms, and fragmented territories. Unlike the clear-cut borders and stable governments of the modern world, medieval Europe was a constantly changing chessboard of power. A traveler who set out on a journey one season might find that by the time they returned, or even while they were still on the road, the political landscape had altered entirely. Alliances broke overnight. Wars erupted suddenly. Truces collapsed without warning. This meant that every border crossing was a gamble. Many regions were controlled by feudal lords, who acted as kings within their own domains, complete with private armies and personal laws. Passing from one lord's territory into another could feel like stepping from friend to foe with no clear rules to guide your way. What had been a peaceful road yesterday could easily become a war zone by the following week. For merchants and traders, this instability was a constant source of dread. A once thriving market town might be sacked and burned in a surprise raid. Castles that had stood guard over safe passage might suddenly shut their gates or turn hostile. Soldiers of one lord might view a passing trader as an enemy simply for bearing goods from a rival territory. Even innocent pilgrims could be mistaken for spies or messengers and arrested, interrogated, or worse. War itself was often brutally indiscriminate. Armies on the march rarely distinguished between combatants and civilians. Foraging soldiers might seize livestock, supplies, and valuables from any village or traveler they encountered. Entire convoys could be looted to feed an advancing army or fill a commander's coffers. The rights and protections of travelers were fragile at best, easily ignored when swords were drawn and power was contested. Sieges presented another dangerous obstacle. If a town or city fell under siege, travelers could find themselves trapped inside for weeks or months, cut off from food, safety, and any hope of escape. Those caught outside the walls faced equal danger, either from the besieging army or from roving bands of mercenaries who followed in the wake of larger conflicts, preying upon anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. In some regions, conflicts between religious factions added yet another layer of risk. Crusades, both grand and small, sent armed bands across Europe and the Holy Land. Travelers of the wrong faith or simply the wrong appearance could be attacked or imprisoned without trial. Even within Christendom, rivalries between Catholic, Orthodox, and later Protestant factions created treacherous divides, where once safe passage could suddenly become life-threatening. Beyond the great wars and crusades, smaller skirmishes constantly simmered across Europe. Border disputes between neighboring lords were common. Petty wars might rage for years over who controlled a strip of land, a valuable river crossing, or a key trade route. Travelers caught in these disputed regions faced suspicion from both sides, sometimes extorted for passage fees, sometimes conscripted into service, or simply robbed and left for dead by desperate soldiers. Political instability also brought banditry in its wake. When armies moved through an area, they often left chaos behind. Displaced peasants, unemployed soldiers, and desperate criminals took to the roads, forming bands of outlaws who terrorized travelers. These men knew the terrain, set traps along common routes, and ambushed travelers far from help. Even well-armed caravans sometimes fell prey to these opportunistic raiders. The risk was not limited to the countryside. Cities, though better defended, could also become dangerous during times of political unrest. Riots might erupt in marketplaces. Noble factions might clash in bloody street fights. Local rulers might seize foreign travelers as hostages or bargaining chips in larger political games. Diplomatic travelers faced their own unique set of dangers. Envoys carrying messages between rulers were sometimes welcomed as honored guests. Other times, they were detained, ransomed, or assassinated. A change in leadership while one was en route could turn a friendly court into a hostile enemy overnight. Even travelers who managed to avoid the worst of war's dangers still bore the constant weight of fear. Rumors traveled quickly along the roads, tales of armies on the march, sieges underway, villages burned to the ground. Every new town brought uncertain news. Was the road ahead safe, or had the world shifted once again? Passports and letters of safe conduct offered some protection, but they were fragile shields. Issued by kings, bishops, or noble lords, these documents promised safe passage through hostile lands. Yet not every soldier, tollkeeper, or border guard honored them. Some demanded bribes to recognize their validity. Others tore them up without a second glance. At times, even nature itself seemed to reflect the instability of the political world. Storms rolled over battlefields. Fields were left fallow as farmers fled invading armies. Roads crumbled into disrepair as rulers diverted resources to fortifications and armies rather than maintenance. The land bore the scars of war as deeply as the people did. And yet, through all this, the roads remained alive. Merchants still carried their goods. Pilgrims still sought their shrines. Messengers still crossed borders with letters sealed in wax. Human determination, whether for profit, faith, duty, or simple hope, drove people onward despite the heavy shadows of political conflict. Now, as you rest in the quiet safety of your own home, feel the weight of these long-forgotten fears drift softly away. The wars of the past no longer reach you. The borders have faded. The road is quiet now. There are no armies ahead, no bandits behind, no rulers demanding tolls or allegiance. Only the steady rhythm of your breath, the warmth of your blankets, and the peaceful embrace of sleep remain. Let your mind release the burdens of the journey as you drift further into rest, safe from the conflicts that once troubled every traveler of the medieval world. As you lie back, your breathing soft and steady, allow your imagination to wander once more through the quiet corridors of history. Tonight, we leave behind the armies and border guards, the toll collectors and highwaymen, and turn instead to one of the quiet but most profound challenges faced by people in the Middle Ages: the difficulty of simply sending a message. In the modern world, communication is instant. A message can cross oceans in seconds, and entire conversations unfold across continents without delay. But in the Middle Ages, communication was painfully slow, uncertain, and often dangerous. The simple act of delivering a letter could become an epic journey in itself. There was no formal postal system for most people. Kings, popes, and a few major institutions maintained their own couriers and messengers, but for the vast majority of people, sending a message relied on personal networks, trust, and sheer luck. A merchant might ask a traveling colleague to carry a letter. A noble might send a trusted servant or a retainer. Monasteries sometimes acted as hubs of information, but even they had limited reach. For ordinary villagers, sending a message even a few miles away might mean finding someone traveling in that direction, and hoping they delivered it faithfully. The letter itself might be nothing more than a scrap of parchment or paper, tied with string or sealed with wax. Its journey was perilous. It could be lost, stolen, damaged by rain, or simply forgotten. And so, word of mouth often remained the most reliable means of spreading news. Travelers carried stories from town to town. Merchants brought gossip from distant markets. Pilgrims shared tales at roadside shrines and inns. But word of mouth was as unreliable as it was rapid. Stories changed in the telling, exaggerated or softened depending on who was speaking. For kings and nobles, the need for secure communication was urgent. They employed messengers on horseback, men trained to ride swiftly across dangerous roads, carrying sealed documents stamped with the Lord's personal signet. These royal couriers faced many of the same dangers as any traveler: bandits, war, harsh weather, and political suspicion. If a messenger carried sensitive information, capture could mean torture or death, not just for the messenger, but for their entire household. To protect their messages, rulers sometimes used codes and ciphers. Early forms of encryption, simple substitution codes or secret languages, made intercepted letters harder to read. But even these primitive ciphers were not foolproof. Clever enemies could break simple codes, and the very existence of a cipher might arouse suspicion. The Church, with its vast network of monasteries, dioceses, and abbeys, maintained some of the most effective long-distance communication. Letters between abbots, bishops, and the papacy in Rome traveled slowly, but with a degree of regularity. Monks often copied and preserved correspondence, creating archives of letters that survive even to this day. But even the church system was limited by distance, politics, and the hazards of the road. Merchants and trading companies created their own informal communication networks. Letters of credit, contracts, and market news moved between trading hubs like Venice, Bruges, and Constantinople. These commercial messages were often entrusted to trusted associates, or shipped with caravans and merchant fleets. But delays were frequent, and piracy or shipwreck could mean total loss. Maritime communication carried its own dangers. Storms could sink ships before letters reached their destination. Pirates might seize merchant vessels and confiscate both cargo and correspondence. Coastal wars and blockades disrupted shipping lanes, leaving important messages stranded for months or lost forever. For ordinary people, even within the same village, communication often depended on face-to-face interaction. Town criers announced important news in marketplaces. Local clergy shared royal proclamations from church pulpits. Travelers returning home brought family news, births, deaths, and marriages. But messages from distant relatives could take years to arrive, if they ever did at all. In times of war or plague, communication could break down entirely. Roads became too dangerous to travel. Entire regions were quarantined. Governments sometimes banned messengers from crossing certain borders. Families separated by conflict might live for decades without knowing whether their loved ones were dead or alive. The slowness of medieval communication also shaped diplomacy. Treaties took months to negotiate, with envoys traveling back and forth between courts. By the time a response arrived, political situations might have changed entirely. Misunderstandings and delays often led to unnecessary wars or prolonged hostilities simply because accurate information could not move fast enough to prevent conflict. Even local government faced challenges. Royal decrees issued from distant capitals might take weeks or months to reach provincial governors. Law enforcement depended heavily on verbal reports and personal oaths, as written reports were scarce and slow. Trials might be delayed for months awaiting evidence, or witnesses who had to travel long distances to testify. Despite these hardships, the people of the Middle Ages displayed remarkable creativity in overcoming their communication challenges. Pilgrims and wandering monks often acted as informal messengers, carrying letters between distant monasteries and families. Traveling merchants served as news carriers, spreading rumors of distant markets and political events. In some areas, complex relay systems developed. In parts of the Islamic world and the Mongol Empire, relay stations known as caravanserai allowed mounted couriers to change horses and continue swiftly on their way, speeding up message delivery over long distances. But such systems were rare in Europe, where geography, politics, and feudal rivalries prevented similar efficiency. Seals played a vital role in authenticating messages. A wax seal bearing the signet of a lord, bishop, or king was often more important than the contents of the letter itself. A sealed letter proved its origin and authorized its bearer to speak or act on the sender's behalf. The breaking of a seal was a serious offense, often punishable by law. The fragility of medieval communication also meant that rumors and misinformation could spread rapidly. False news of royal deaths, military victories, or plagues sometimes caused panic and unrest before the truth arrived. Rulers struggled to control information, using heralds and public proclamations to try to shape public perception. But control was always limited. For most people, patience was the only solution. Letters took weeks, months, or even years to arrive. A trader might leave home on a journey and not hear from his family until he returned years later. A son sent to war might disappear for decades, with only occasional rumors offering hints of his fate. And yet, despite these barriers, the human desire to connect remained strong. Messages still traveled. News still spread. Families still found ways to reach one another across impossible distances. It was a slow, fragile, and uncertain web, but a web that held civilization together, one precious message at a time. Now, as you rest deeper in the quiet comfort of your room, free from the burdens of slow and uncertain messages, let your mind drift peacefully away. There are no couriers to wait for, no sealed letters lost to storms, no anxious weeks spent hoping for news. In this moment, you are perfectly connected to the present, safe, calm, and ready for sleep. Let the quiet hum of the distant past fade as you relax even more, your breathing steady, your thoughts gentle and slow. As you sink deeper into rest, breathing calmly, let your mind wander once again to the long, twisting roads of the Middle Ages. You have braved the dangerous roads, the toll collectors, the outlaws, and the messengers struggling to carry words across the world. But there remains another invisible obstacle waiting for every traveler. An obstacle not made of swords, or bandits, or weather, but of words themselves. This is the silent wall of language. In the modern world, we often take for granted how easy it is to cross linguistic boundaries. Translation apps, international languages, and global media allow people from distant lands to communicate almost instantly. But in the Middle Ages, language itself could be a locked door that few could open. Europe alone was a patchwork of tongues. From the British Isles to the Iberian Peninsula, from the German forests to the Italian coasts, dozens of languages were spoken, often changing dramatically over short distances. English, French, German, Spanish, Italian, all in their early, evolving forms. But even these broad names conceal enormous variety. Dialects could differ so sharply that two villages only a few days' walk apart might barely understand each other. Imagine a merchant leaving his home in southern France. As he travels north toward Flanders, the language changes gradually. Occitan becomes different shades of French, then Wallon, then Flemish. The words twist and shift, familiar phrases become foreign, and soon he finds himself in a world where no one speaks his tongue. Even within kingdoms, local dialects posed constant challenges. A peasant from Cornwall might not understand a merchant from London. A German from Bavaria might struggle to speak with someone from Saxony. These were not simply accents or quaint local expressions, they were nearly different languages. For nobles and clergy, Latin served as a bridge. The educated elite across Europe shared this ancient tongue as the language of scholarship, law, and religion. Monks copied manuscripts in Latin. Priests preached from Latin texts. Letters between kings and popes were often written in this common script. but Latin belonged mostly to the learned few. The average villager, merchant, or soldier knew nothing of its precise grammar or lofty vocabulary. For travelers, this meant that even simple tasks, buying bread, hiring a room, negotiating a toll, could become complicated, frustrating, and risky. Gestures, drawings, and rudimentary sign language often filled the gaps. Coins became one of the few universally understood forms of communication. But even money brought its own confusions, as different regions minted their own currencies, and not all coins were recognized or valued equally. Some travelers hired interpreters or guides who spoke multiple languages. These individuals were highly prized, though not always entirely trustworthy. A dishonest interpreter could easily twist a negotiation to his own advantage or betray his employer to local authorities. Even among trusted guides, misunderstandings remained common. The farther one traveled, the more complex the language barrier became. A merchant journeying from England to Constantinople might pass through lands where English, French, German, Hungarian, Greek, and Turkish were all spoken. Each new region presented its own linguistic puzzle. Even skilled polyglots often knew only fragments of each tongue, enough to bargain in the marketplace but not enough to navigate local laws or complex negotiations. In the bustling cities of trade, Venice, Bruges, Alexandria, a kind of informal polyglot culture emerged. Merchants learned key phrases in many languages. Markets rang with voices blending Arabic, Greek, Italian, French, and others. Business often relied on a mixture of words, hand signals, and shared customs. In these cosmopolitan hubs, trade flourished despite the tangled web of tongues. But outside these rare centers of trade, linguistic isolation was profound. A peasant born in a rural village might live his entire life hearing only the local dialect. News from distant lands, when it arrived at all, was filtered through layers of translation, often becoming distorted or unintelligible. In times of war, language barriers could be deadly. Soldiers invading foreign lands struggled to understand local civilians. Miscommunications led to violence, suspicion, and cruelty. Orders shouted in unfamiliar tongues created chaos on the battlefield. Prisoners who could not explain themselves were often executed, or enslaved simply because no one could understand their pleas. Pilgrims journeying to distant holy sites faced similar challenges. A pilgrim from England traveling to Jerusalem might encounter languages he had never heard before. Each border crossing brought new tongues and new uncertainties. The kindly help of a multilingual monk or fellow traveler could mean the difference between safe passage and disaster. Even religion, which often provided a shared framework, could not entirely overcome these barriers. Mass was spoken in Latin, but the sermons that explained it varied in every language. Christian pilgrims struggled to communicate with Eastern Orthodox priests. Muslims and Christians alike faced the daunting task of interpreting one another's prayers, laws, and customs. The language barrier also shaped law and justice. A foreigner brought before a local court might not understand the charges, or be able to defend himself. Trials depended heavily on oaths, witnesses, and confessions. Without a trusted interpreter, legal outcomes were often harsh and irreversible. Despite these difficulties, some individuals did bridge the gaps. Diplomats, spies, and traders often became skilled linguists. Monasteries taught Latin and sometimes Greek. Jewish communities, scattered across many lands, often acted as cultural and linguistic intermediaries, speaking multiple tongues fluently. These rare individuals were invaluable, but they could not be everywhere. For most medieval travelers, every conversation was a negotiation. Every market was a guessing game. Every border crossing was a test of patience and creativity. The wrong word or misunderstood phrase could cost money, goods, or even one's life. And yet, humanity's deep desire to connect overcame these immense obstacles again and again. Merchants bargained. Pilgrims prayed. Kings negotiated peace treaties. Letters were painstakingly written, translated, and carried across dangerous lands. Through sheer determination, people continued to cross the boundaries of language. Now, as you lie safely in your bed, far from the confusion of foreign tongues and difficult conversations, let the noise of ancient marketplaces fade gently from your mind. There are no strange words here, no misunderstood phrases, no anxious attempts to explain yourself. Only the soft rhythm of your breath, and the peaceful stillness of rest remain. Let your mind float gently into sleep, carried not by uncertain words, but by the calm certainty of quiet. As you continue to drift gently into the soft quiet of history, we now turn to a force that ruled every traveler's journey, no matter their wealth, status, or purpose: the vast, unpredictable power of nature itself. In the Middle Ages, the natural world was not a picturesque backdrop, it was a living force filled with dangers, mysteries, and threats that could turn any journey into a desperate struggle for survival. The medieval traveler ventured into a landscape that was only partially tamed. Vast stretches of wilderness, dense forests, endless marshes, desolate moors, rugged mountains, lay between villages and cities. Many of these places were still wild, rarely patrolled, and filled with dangers both seen and unseen. Forests, in particular, loomed large in the imagination of medieval people. They were not the carefully managed parks we know today, but deep, dark, and often terrifying places. The dense canopies blocked out the sunlight, leaving travelers in permanent twilight even during the day. Paths twisted and disappeared. Landmarks shifted with the seasons. It was easy to become lost, wandering in circles for days without ever finding a familiar landmark. Within these shadowy woods, wild animals roamed freely. Wolves were among the most feared predators. Packs could silently stalk travelers for miles, waiting for signs of weakness or vulnerability. Stories of lone travelers attacked and dragged off into the trees were common enough to feel plausible. In harsh winters, when food was scarce, wolves grew bolder, sometimes venturing dangerously close to villages and roads. Bears also inhabited parts of medieval Europe. Though generally avoiding human contact, a startled bear could be a deadly encounter for an unlucky traveler. The raw strength of these creatures, combined with their unpredictable nature, made them deeply feared. Even knights with armor and weapons would hesitate to confront a charging bear alone. In certain regions, large cats like lynxes or even leopards, escaped from noblemen's private menageries, might occasionally roam the countryside, creating an exotic and terrifying threat. These sightings became the seeds of frightening legends, mixing fact with superstition. But not all dangers had claws and fangs. Venomous snakes lurked in southern regions. A single bite could bring fever, swelling, and death in an age when medicine offered little relief. Even harmless creatures like mosquitoes and fleas carried hidden dangers, spreading diseases that could devastate entire communities. The wilderness also held dangers of a more insidious kind: the elements themselves. Sudden storms could unleash sheets of rain, turning dry roads into impassable rivers of mud. Lightning strikes might ignite forests, or strike down lone travelers crossing open fields. Winds howled across mountain passes, pushing men and animals dangerously close to cliffs and precipices. In winter, snow became a silent killer. Thick drifts buried paths and covered landmarks. Blizzards could trap entire caravans, freezing travelers in place while supplies dwindled. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Entire bodies might vanish beneath the snow, not discovered again until the thaw of spring. In the heat of summer, travelers faced different but equally serious risks. Heat stroke claimed those who pushed too hard under the burning sun. Dehydration became a constant threat as wells dried and rivers shrank. Swarms of insects tormented both humans and animals, their bites leaving painful welts and carrying illness. Swamps and marshes presented their own unique hazards. The soft, unstable ground could swallow carts, horses, and people alike. Hidden pools of stagnant water bred diseases like malaria. Mist and fog concealed treacherous footing, and travelers often wandered blindly until they found themselves hopelessly lost. The natural world's unpredictability extended to the rivers and seas. Ferries and small boats were often the only way to cross wide rivers, but strong currents, sudden floods, or poorly maintained vessels led to many tragic drownings. Bridges were rare, and those that existed were often crude, slippery, or dangerously unstable. Those who dared to travel by sea faced even greater risks. Medieval ships were small, fragile, and constantly at the mercy of wind and weather. Sudden storms could destroy ships in minutes. Navigation was rudimentary. Getting lost at sea was terrifyingly easy. Pirates, too, stalked the coastlines, seizing both cargo and passengers with brutal efficiency. And above all these tangible dangers loomed the heavy presence of medieval superstition. Every traveler knew of strange creatures said to haunt the wild places, giant serpents, trolls, witches, and spirits that could curse or lead the unwary astray. Many firmly believed that certain forests or crossroads were inhabited by demons or malicious fairies, ready to strike down the unprotected traveler. Because of these fears, many travelers carried talismans, charms, or relics believed to ward off evil. Some hung small crosses around their necks. Others carried small bags of herbs or bones, passed down through generations. Pilgrims sometimes carried blessed objects from shrines, believing they offered divine protection on the journey. Travelers often grouped together for safety, not only from bandits but from the dangers of nature itself. A larger group could fend off wild animals, find shelter more easily, and pool supplies in case of bad weather. Caravan leaders and experienced guides were highly valued for their knowledge of safe routes, reliable campsites, and local conditions. Even so, accidents remained common. A simple fall from a horse could break bones. A poorly built campfire could spark a forest blaze. Spoiled food or contaminated water could sicken an entire group. In the wild, even minor injuries could quickly become life-threatening infections. But despite all these dangers, people still traveled. Merchants risked the wild for profit. Pilgrims endured hardship for spiritual salvation. Soldiers marched through hostile terrain for war. Messengers crossed mountains and rivers to deliver vital news. The world was wide, and the need to move across it was stronger than even nature's most fearsome obstacles. The natural world in the Middle Ages was never fully conquered. Even as towns grew and roads improved, the forests remained vast, the rivers wide, and the storms unpredictable. Every journey remained an act of courage and determination. Now, as you lie safely tucked away from the wild dangers of medieval nature, let the quiet calm of your surroundings remind you of the peace and safety you enjoy. There are no wolves in the shadows. No storms howl at your door. The wild world rests far away, leaving you free to relax, to breathe deeply, and to slip gently into restful sleep. Let each breath carry you further from the rugged paths of old, into the soft, safe stillness of the present. As you continue to drift deeper into rest, we now arrive at one of the most overlooked, yet most constant burdens faced by travelers in the Middle Ages, the unrelenting weight of exhaustion. While bandits, language barriers, wild animals, and brutal weather presented dangers that came and went, fatigue was always there, quiet, heavy, and inescapable. Every medieval journey began early. Before the sun rose, travelers packed their few belongings, harnessed their animals, and set off while the world was still dark and cold. The idea was simple: cover as many miles as possible before the heat of the day, or the dangers of night made travel impossible. There were no headlights to light the way, no smooth highways, no consistent schedules. Only the long, uneven road stretching endlessly ahead. Most travelers journeyed on foot. This meant walking mile after mile, day after day, on roads that were often little more than dirt paths or deeply rutted tracks. Stones and roots turned every step into a risk for twisted ankles and stubbed toes. Mud could suck at boots, slowing progress and sapping strength. Dust choked travelers in dry months, coating their clothes and filling their lungs. Fatigue began early and grew heavier with each passing hour. For those fortunate enough to have a horse or mule, the journey was only slightly easier. Riding for hours was physically demanding in its own right. The constant jostling and swaying of the saddle wore on the back, hips, and thighs. Saddle sores and bruises were common. Horses, too, tired quickly, needing rest, food, and water. A sick or injured animal could turn a difficult journey into a disaster. The pace was slow. A good day might cover 15 to 20 miles on foot, sometimes less if the weather was bad or the roads poor. At this rate, even short trips took days, while longer journeys stretched into weeks or months. Each night, travelers set up crude camps or sought shelter in inns, monasteries, or the occasional hospitable village. Sleep was rarely restful. In the open, travelers curled under blankets or cloaks, exposed to cold, rain, and biting insects. In the forests, the distant howls of wolves or the snap of branches could shatter fragile rest. Even in inns, sleep was far from peaceful. Guests often shared crowded rooms with strangers. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, damp clothing, and poorly extinguished fires. Snores, coughs, and restless shifting filled the darkness. Every dawn came too soon. Bodies still aching from the day before were forced back onto the road. Blistered feet throbbed. Shoulders ached from carrying loads. Hunger gnawed constantly, as food supplies were limited and of poor quality. Dried bread, salted meat, and hard cheese provided little comfort or nutrition. There were no energy drinks, no painkillers, no soft beds awaiting at day's end. Travelers often grew thin and weak. Illnesses spread easily in the close quarters of traveling groups. Stomach ailments, fevers, and respiratory infections were common companions on the road. Once sick, travelers had few options but to push forward, as falling behind often meant being left alone and vulnerable. Even experienced travelers found themselves worn down by the grind. Caravans of merchants, accustomed to the road, aged quickly under the constant strain. Pilgrims, driven by faith, often staggered along in various states of exhaustion, many collapsing before reaching their destination. Soldiers marched in columns, carrying heavy armor and weapons for miles, only to arrive at battlefields already drained of strength. For many, the most dangerous part of the journey was not a sudden attack or accident, it was the slow, steady draining of energy, day after day, until bodies simply gave out. Exhaustion made travelers more vulnerable to every other danger, their reactions slowed, their judgment clouded, their will to fight or flee diminished. And still, the demands of the road left little room for rest. A storm might wash out a bridge, forcing a longer detour. A sick animal might require hours of care. Bandit activity might delay movement, leaving travelers racing to reach safety before nightfall. Every delay stretched already thin resources. The mental toll was as heavy as the physical. Travelers had to remain constantly alert, watching for dangers, navigating confusing paths, bargaining at unfamiliar markets. The strain of making decisions while hungry, sore, and sleep-deprived wore on even the strongest minds. Mistakes became inevitable. The landscape itself offered few comforts. Long stretches of flat countryside became monotonous. Mountains tested the lungs and legs. Marshes sapped strength with each slow, squelching step. Even beautiful scenery became oppressive after weeks of endless travel. To fight off this relentless fatigue, travelers developed small rituals. They sang songs, told stories, or recited prayers to pass the time and distract from pain. Pilgrims carried symbols of their faith, drawing comfort from the belief that their suffering served a higher purpose. Merchants focused on thoughts of profits waiting at their destination. Some travelers formed deep bonds with their companions, sharing burdens and encouraging one another. Others traveled alone, drawing on sheer stubbornness to push forward. In both cases, exhaustion remained a constant shadow. And when, at long last, travelers reached their destination, the fatigue did not immediately lift. Muscles remained sore, sleep came in fitful bursts, and nerves remained on edge. Recovery took days or weeks, depending on the length and hardship of the journey. Some never fully recovered, their health permanently damaged by the endless fatigue of the road. Today, we rarely think of travel in such terms. We board cars, trains, or planes, arriving hours later, often refreshed and ready. But in the Middle Ages, travel was as much a battle against one's own body as it was a journey across space. Every step was earned. Every mile was costly. Every destination was a hard-won victory. And now, as you lie comfortably in your own bed, let the weariness of those long-forgotten travelers stay far from you. Here, your body is light. Your breath is easy. Your muscles are soft and relaxed, and touched by the burdens of medieval roads. With each breath, let the thought of endless roads fade away. Here, there are no miles to cover, no dawns to rise before. Only peace. Only rest. As you continue to drift comfortably into stillness, we turn now to one of the few bright spots on a medieval traveler's long and exhausting journey, the rare oasis of rest found in inns, hostels, monasteries, and kind strangers' homes. Though not always as comfortable as one might hope, these moments offered brief relief from the constant hardships of the road. In the Middle Ages, the availability of lodging depended heavily on where you traveled. In more populated regions, particularly along busy trade routes or pilgrimage paths, there were occasional inns or taverns where a traveler could find food, shelter, and, if lucky, companionship for the night. These establishments varied widely in quality. The typical medieval inn was a simple structure, often made of wood, stone, or wattle and daub. A wooden sign swinging in the wind might identify the establishment, a painted image of a lion, a crown, a star, or another symbol, as many travelers could not read. These signs served as welcome beacons for the weary, signaling a pause in their long ordeal. Upon entering, guests would often find themselves in a single large room, smoky from a central hearth, where food was cooked and warmth provided. The air inside was thick with the mingling aromas of roasting meat, spilled ale, damp cloaks, and unwashed bodies. Tables crowded the space, where merchants negotiated deals, pilgrims swapped stories, and locals gathered for gossip and drink. Private rooms were rare and usually reserved for wealthier travelers. Most guests slept together in shared quarters, sometimes on straw-filled mattresses, sometimes directly on the floor. Beds, when available, were simple wooden frames with coarse linen sheets, often crawling with lice or fleas. Snoring, coughing, and restless movement filled the night air, making deep sleep a rare luxury. The food served at these inns reflected the limited resources of the time. Thick stews, often made from whatever meat and vegetables were available, were common fare. Travelers might receive black bread, hard cheese, and salted fish. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare, and spices were expensive luxuries found only in the finest establishments. Drink flowed freely, primarily in the form of weak ale or wine. Water was often unsafe to consume, so even children drank watered-down beer. The warmth of alcohol offered a brief comfort to aching bodies, though it also added to the noisiness and occasional rowdiness of the common room. In addition to inns, monasteries often provided shelter, especially for pilgrims. These religious houses were bound by charity to offer assistance to those in need. A traveler arriving at a monastery gate would be greeted by monks who provided simple food, clean water, and a place to sleep, usually in separate guest quarters. Though Spartan, these accommodations were cleaner and more orderly than most inns. Monasteries were places of quiet and reflection. The silence of stone corridors, the soft flicker of candlelight, and the gentle chants of monks at prayer created a rare atmosphere of peace. Here, travelers could briefly feel safe from the dangers of the road and the fatigue of constant movement. Hospitals, too, sometimes offered lodging. Unlike modern hospitals, medieval versions often served as hospices for the poor, the sick, and the traveling. Run by religious orders, these institutions provided food and rest for the body, along with prayers for the soul. For many travelers, however, formal lodging was a luxury they could not afford. The poor often relied on the kindness of strangers or the shelter of barns, stables, and abandoned buildings. A sympathetic farmer might offer space in a hayloft, while a village priest might allow sleeping in a church nave. These humble shelters offered protection from the elements, though not always from cold, vermin, or illness. There were, of course, risks even in these brief moments of rest. Unscrupulous innkeepers sometimes overcharged or provided spoiled food. Theft was common in crowded sleeping quarters, where tired travelers might awaken to find their coin purses lighter. Fights could break out among strangers sharing close quarters, particularly after too much ale. Yet for all these flaws, the chance to rest under a roof, to eat a warm meal, and to sit by a fire was a precious reprieve. Travelers cherished these brief interludes, using them to repair clothing, tend to sore feet, and share news with others on the road. Information exchanged at inns was often vital, news of dangerous bandits ahead, broken bridges, or safe places to rest further down the road. In heavily traveled areas, especially near major cities or pilgrimage sites, entire communities grew around the business of serving travelers. Markets offered supplies, blacksmiths repaired wagons and shoes, and bathhouses, rare though they were, provided opportunities for some measure of cleanliness. These bustling waypoints offered a small taste of stability amid the chaos of travel. But beyond the occasional comfort, the road always called travelers onward. Even after a brief night's rest, the dawn demanded movement. Bags were packed again. Boots were laced. Bodies, still stiff from yesterday's walk, resumed their slow march. The warm hearth faded behind them, replaced once more by dirt paths, uncertain weather, and endless miles. As you imagine these brief moments of comfort, let them remind you of your own soft bed, your own steady shelter. You are not on the road. There are no crowded rooms, or cold drafts to disturb you. The flicker of ancient fires has been replaced by the steady peace of your own quiet room. With each gentle breath, allow yourself to sink deeper into rest. The long journey of medieval travelers fades into the distance, their footsteps growing quieter with every moment. You are safe. You are still. The road has ended, and only calm remains. As you continue to relax and drift further into stillness, we now explore one of the quietest, yet most profound burdens that medieval travelers carried with them on every journey, the weight of their own minds. Beyond the bandits, the weather, the hunger, and the fatigue, there was always the inner struggle, one that never left, no matter how many miles they crossed. In the Middle Ages, travel was a venture into deep uncertainty. Roads vanished into unfamiliar territories. Familiar faces faded behind as the first steps were taken. And ahead, always ahead, lay the unknown. Anxiety was a constant, gnawing companion. For many travelers, the fear began before the journey even started. Would they reach their destination? Would they find safe shelter along the way? Would illness strike? Would their coin purse last? Would they return home at all? These questions circled endlessly in their thoughts as they prepared to leave. Once on the road, these fears often deepened. Each unfamiliar village brought its own risks. A wrong turn could lead to isolation in a hostile landscape. Strange accents and customs heightened the sense of being an outsider. Every encounter with strangers was weighed carefully, friend or foe. Each day brought the possibility of danger that could not be predicted or controlled. Loneliness was another heavy burden. Though some traveled in groups, many journeyed alone, with only their own thoughts for company. Days stretched long and quiet, broken only by the rhythmic sound of footsteps or hoofbeats. The vast landscapes, miles of empty fields, dark forests, and distant mountains amplified the feeling of isolation. Even among fellow travelers, true companionship was rare. Many were strangers brought together by necessity rather than friendship. Trust was limited. Conversations were brief, and travelers often guarded their words, cautious of revealing too much. After all, any companion could just as easily become a threat. The nights were often the most difficult. Darkness magnified every worry. The mind replayed the events of the day, wondering if a careless word or a missed landmark might have invited danger. Strange noises in the night stirred old superstitions. Was it an animal, a bandit, or something more sinister? Alone beneath the stars, fears felt larger and heavier. For pilgrims, these inner struggles were often framed as tests of faith. The hardships were viewed as part of their spiritual journey, a chance to suffer as penance or to prove devotion. Yet even the most devout sometimes found their faith tested by exhaustion, hunger, and fear. Merchants worried over their goods and profits. Would their wares survive the journey? Would markets still welcome them? Would taxes, tolls, or thieves strip them of their earnings? Each risk threatened not only their wealth but their livelihoods. Messengers carried the anxiety of their employers' expectations. A delayed or lost message could mean political disaster, lost alliances, or even war. Every hour lost increased the pressure, adding another weight to their shoulders. Soldiers marched under constant threat. Not only did they face the hazards of the road, but also the looming prospect of battle at journey's end. The knowledge of violence ahead bred its own kind of restless unease. For many, there was also the ever-present fear of simply not arriving. A broken wheel, a bandit attack, a sudden illness, any of these could bring the journey to a premature end. Every day survived was a small victory, yet it brought no guarantee for the next. News traveled slowly in the Middle Ages. Families left behind had no way of knowing if a traveler was safe or lost. Months might pass before word arrived, if it arrived at all. This silence weighed heavily on both those traveling and those waiting at home. The landscape itself reflected this psychological strain. Endless miles of the same view, a twisting road through woods or plains, could feel oppressive. Without modern maps or signs, every hilltop brought uncertainty. Was this the right path, or had they wandered off course? The mind constantly second-guessed, questioning every turn, every choice. Superstition filled the gaps left by knowledge. Travelers carried amulets to ward off evil spirits. They avoided certain roads rumored to be cursed. Tales of haunted crossroads and bewitched forests whispered from village to village, feeding anxiety with every retelling. The toll of these mental struggles was cumulative. Anxiety robbed travelers of precious rest. Loneliness gnawed at resilience. The constant state of alertness drained energy that could not easily be replenished. Even when physical dangers were absent, the battle inside the mind wore travelers down. Yet remarkably, people continued to travel. They carried these invisible burdens with courage, pressing forward despite their fears. They sought comfort in prayer, in routine, in small victories, a safe crossing, a friendly face, a warm fire at day's end. Those who survived their journeys returned home not only physically tired but often emotionally changed. They carried stories of distant places and near escapes. Many became wiser, some became more fearful, and others carried invisible scars long after their travels ended. Tonight, you do not carry these burdens. There are no dark forests ahead of you, no lonely paths under strange skies. The quiet room around you is safe and still. The fears of uncertain roads belong to the distant past. With every slow, steady breath, allow these ancient anxieties to fade further away. The travelers of old may rest at last, and so may you. You are home. You are safe. You are free from the long road,